Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. We want to talk about something that is a phenomenon in the, I would say, pretty much exclusively in the Myers-Briggs community. That it's kind of like it's like the pink elephant in the room, maybe.
The thing no one talks about.
Yeah, or maybe they do talk about it, but they only kind of talk about it with each other, and I don't think a lot of people address it openly. And that is this idea of intuitive superiority that surfaces when people discover Myers-Briggs, in particular, intuitives, people who test out as intuitive types. The reason why we want to talk about it is this came up for me recently when I was having a conversation on Twitter. Now, one of the things I hate about conversations on Twitter is that you're limited to, 127 characters?
140
characters, and that includes like the name or the handle of the person you're talking to. And I'm pretty verbose. I have a tendency to do a lot of talking. And so I find that Twitter, even though I appreciate it as a platform, as a medium, I recognize that a lot of what I say ends up being misconstrued. And so I ended up having a conversation with somebody who is a sensor type, an ESFP, on Twitter. And they felt that something I said was evidencing intuitive superiority. So I did what I could to clarify my position in 140 characters. And it ended up being kind of like I'm sorry, I didn't realize that that's what you meant. Or at least the person who said it indicated that the reason why they may have taken it to indicate a superior or a superiority stance for intuitives or intuition is because they have run into that sort of behavior before online, not surprisingly. And so you and I offline had a conversation around, we talk about the Intuitive Awakening. We have the Intuitive Awakening Facebook group. Intuitive Awakening is part of our call to action or our mission, which is get the concept of the difference between intuition and sensing into public consciousness so that when somebody is intuitive, they are not, considered broken or there's something wrong with them, that there's a lot more space held. Well, unfortunately, what ends up happening, and the reason why, by the way, the reason why we need this, or at least you and I feel that we need this as a culture, as a society, as kind of like a world culture, is that intuitives can feel quite disenfranchised when they're raised by people who don't understand them. And there can be a lot of maybe self-loathing or a sense of disenfranchisement when an intuitive feels like they're not understood, that they're the black sheep. There's a lot of feelings of inferiority or implied inferiority that gets sort of dumped on the intuitive.
I would say the word there would be marginalization, even more than inferiority.
Yeah.
I think they probably feel more marginalized than inferior.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think marginalization is a better word, absolutely. So there's that sense of marginalization, and then a person in this position may discover Myers-Briggs, may discover the sensing intuition dichotomy, may discover that they're an intuitive and what that means, and then all of a sudden just run with it and take all that feeling of disenfranchisement and pour it into a sense of superiority, like somehow being an intuitive is better. And because Myers-Briggs is a tool that requires a certain amount of pattern recognition at this point, because it's not like inducted into hard science, you have to have a bit of a leap of faith if you're going to be into Myers-Briggs and recognize that, maybe you have to fight some of the powers that be that say that, oh no, it's all BS, and you kind of go, oh no, it's not a BS. You have to understand how patterns work. And so because it's in that frame that requires a bit more pattern recognition, it has a tendency to be populated by intuitives who favor the art of pattern recognition for the things that they buy into. But that doesn't mean that there's not plenty of sensors who are into Myers-Briggs. Obviously, there is a huge collective of sensors who are very into Myers-Briggs, go way down the rabbit's hole, understand cognitive functions, are super into typing people, just find it really fascinating, just intrinsically fascinating, and use it as a tool for understanding others. So it's not that there's no sensors in this world, but it does tend to be disproportionately represented by intuitives. And so when you take a group that feels marginalized in a normal context and put them into a niche context where now all of a sudden they're surrounded by way more people like them than normal, And they all come from this disenfranchised state or marginalized state. And now all of a sudden they're all patting each other and themselves on the back. You could see why some bad behaviors may surface from intuitives, especially young intuitives or people who've experienced a lot of pain and might be at a place in their life where they're still trying to heal from that trauma. So this is a phenomenon. It's the pink elephant in the room in the Myers-Briggs community. People acting like intuitives or being an intuitive is somehow better than being a sensor. And some of the raw nerves that sensors may have around this topic. So we wanted to talk about it. We wanted to mention maybe some ways of looking at this for both the benefit of intuitives and sensors so that we can make some space for the reality of it and what to do about it. Some perspectives to come from that might mitigate some of this behavior or perspective shift a little bit to see how we can show up as intuitives better and how we can honor sensors better. And then also maybe talk a little bit about how this sort of behavior will actually harm us and anything like an intuitive awakening. Why we need to be better. Why intuitives need to be better behaved and representing intuitives and intuition in a better way. And to make sure that we're not actually cutting our nose off to spite our face in this intuitive awakening.
One thing I want to mention, if you're a brand new listener, you've never listened to one of our podcasts before, you need to understand that we don't just talk about Myers-Briggs or typology for its own sake. One of the things that drives us here is we see typology, we see understanding yourself and others as one of the foundational elements of personal growth. So everything we talk about comes from a personal growth framework and how we approach all of these topics and subjects. That's just an important distinction. If you're a brand new listener, that's our focus here at Personality Hacker. And our personal development focus also includes when we talk about movements, when we talk about an intuitive awakening, we want it to be from a personal development framework. Now, this idea of an intuitive awakening, or, we've got the sensing versus intuitive split on the dichotomy, with the perceiving dichotomy in the Myers-Briggs system. We actually have seen a movement spring up in the last few years around another dichotomy, the first dichotomy in the Myers-Briggs system, which is introvert versus extrovert. And we've seen a huge introvert movement pop up. There's been books written, TED Talks, speakers, entire business arrangements constructed around empowering introverts in the world to say, oh, I'm quiet. I don't speak out all the time in the world. I don't emote outwardly. I'm quiet to myself. I'm an introvert in business or my family. I'm not broken. That's just how I'm wired. In fact, not only is that just how I'm wired, that actually might be an advantage to me in the business world or my family life or my social arrangements. Being an introvert, there's literally a book called The Introvert Advantage. We even done a podcast with the same title. It's this idea that you're not broken as an introvert. You have a lot of internal power. You've got a lot of great things you bring to the table based on your introversion.
Yeah, well, and you have specific needs. That's one of the major things that have been busted. One of the myths that have been busted through the introvert movement is that, some introverts do show up quiet. And that's one of the things that has made them feel different than others. But some introverts are not super quiet, but they have a need for introvert time. And there's been a lot of very interesting information that's come out with how introverts' minds are wired differently than extroverts' minds are wired, which comes as no surprise to us, but it's nice to have the technical information there, like the scientific data in front of us to indicate that, an introvert's mind goes through basically more channels when it's making decisions. So it's nice to be able to understand that the needs that introverts have are based on something that they can't do anything about, which is how their mind is fundamentally wired. And so what's been great about this movement is it's been very encouraging for me in the movement that we want to create, which is an intuitive awakening, to go, this can actually work. Now, there's a pretty big difference, though, between the introvert movement and the intuitive awakening that we're talking about. There's a couple key differences that are going to make the intuitive awakening more challenging. The first one is that introversion and extroversion has been generally accepted in the psychological community. It's part of DISC. It's part of the typology systems that the psychological world has, deemed as okay, like they accept it introversion, extroversion is a part of that. And so there's going to be more funding available for studying introversion and extroversion. There's going to be more, just kind of a general sense of open arms with this kind of information. Whereas sensing and intuition are pretty unique to the Myers-Briggs system. And the Myers-Briggs system, if it ever had a time period of being faddish in the psychological world, I'm not really sure when that was, but it's certainly not right now. There's a lot of people in the psychological world who think that Myers-Briggs is, foundless or whatever. And that's fine. It's understandable. We did an entire PHQ on why our suspicions of why that's the case. So if you want to go look up that PHQ, please feel free to do so. But as far as sensing and intuition, there's not going to be as much funding thrown the direction of figuring out the wiring, sort of on a neurological level. What's the wiring between sensing and intuition? So we're gonna start from a less scientifically credible place.
It's also more obvious. I mean, most people when they're out in the world, even if you're not a profiler or into really typology systems, most people go, okay, that person over there's an introvert. Okay, that person over there's an extrovert. They have it appears on the surface to be very obvious to all of us. Even if it's not, it appears that way to most people.
Yeah, I think people self-assess their introversion or extroversion, they're not always accurate. They don't always understand what that means. But yeah, it's enough in our social consciousness that we accept it as a principle. And sensing and intuition is not. I mean, that's a bigger, that is a taller mountain to climb for an intuitive awakening.
The other piece of that too is when it comes to introversion versus extroversion, it's about a 50-50 split in the population. There's about 50% introverts, 50% extroverts. So 50% of the population is affected by introversion. And they say, hey, this is something that affects my daily life. I feel like I need to be more honored here. Whereas if you go over to how we perceive the world, our perceiving process, which is that sensing or intuition process, only 25%, 1 in 4 people are intuitive or use an intuitive process primarily to see the world. So that split also, there's just so many more percentage-wise people who identify with the sensing process of perceiving the world than that identify with the intuitive process. So you just have sheer numbers are lower there. Whereas in the introversion-extroversion split, you've got almost an even split down the middle.
Yeah, so you're gonna have more numbers who are relieved by the information, and it's gonna be easier to create a tipping point. I think the third part of it too is that, as an extrovert, I'm happy that introverts are getting their needs met. I'm glad that there's been an introvert movement, an introvert awakening for people to get their needs met. But I'm going to be honest, I don't wish I was an introvert. I'm glad I'm an extrovert. And I would imagine that introverts are glad that they're introverts. There's clear advantages with both, and they're well articulated. I think it's pretty obvious what the extrovert advantage is, and I think that we're coming online with what the introvert advantages are. So it seems like it's a pretty fair, balanced world right there. We need both of them represented, and I think we all understand, and I think it's easy to understand that. However, in sensing and intuition seems to be pretty unique and specific to the Myers-Briggs community. And the Myers-Briggs community, or at least how maybe it's been co-opted, or again, based on that feeling of disenfranchisement and marginalization, there tends to be very romantic ways that we paint intuition, and in particular, the 2 intuitive cognitive functions. There's a mystical element oftentimes. There's a magic thinking element. I mean, it's hard not to do that. It's hard not to explain the 2 intuitive processes without pulling on some, kind of almost mystical elements, because we've talked about the advanced pattern recognition that the intuitive processes bring. And because of that, it's a projection. Oftentimes the conclusions are projections of things that haven't happened yet, or they're suspicions or speculations on things that can't be pointed to. So it's easy to first deny its existence, which is how most intuitives feel the world has treated them. And then when you go, no, it's a real thing, it's easy to create a romanticism around it. Like this is a superior place to come from. And so if with the introvert movement, there doesn't seem to be this sense of like introvert. Okay, I've run into it online. Introverts are better than extroverts. I even saw some woman write that she's never met an extrovert that wasn't a sociopath. And I'm like, come on, really? Yeah, 50% of the population is sociopathic. Okay. But there's, I mean, it's a person who feels marginalized or dealing with their own traumas around it. This is the part of their healing process, and they're figuring it out. But it doesn't seem to feel like the same kind of atmosphere as the intuitive sensor split atmosphere online. And I have read sensors saying, I wish I was an intuitive, or I want to become an intuitive. How does that happen? There's a romanticism that gets painted around intuition, which is actually going to harm any sort of movement that we might have to get intuition as an understood part of people in the social unconscious. It's going to hurt us because we don't want it to be romanticized. We want it to be almost made mundane. We want it to be mundane so that people can be more accepting of it, because it is mundane in the sense that it is a daily experience for us. For intuitives, it is our daily experience to be intuitive. It's pretty mundane for us. So this idea that it's romantic and that if you're a sensor, you're not as good as an intuitive, and this idea that intuitives are kind of dicks to sensors online in a lot of ways, like they act superior. This is a real challenge in trying to create an intuitive awakening, an intuitive awakening would be good for all people.
Yeah.
But if we paint it as some sort of wait until we become your supreme overlords, that's not going to be good for anybody. So we have some unique challenges in the intuitive awakening that the introvert movement didn't have, and we have to be really conscientious and aware of them. If we feel that intuitives are superior to sensors, that starts with us and rooting that out. You can't come from that position, first of all, because it's wildly inaccurate, right? Intuitives are not superior to sensors. And second of all, it's only going to create win-loses. It's a zero-sum game. It's this idea that sensors have been in power, so now intuitives need to be in power, or whatever is the rationalization. But we're not coming from a zero-sum position. We're coming from a position of how do we get everybody's needs met so we can all be better versions of ourselves and maybe turn a little bit of this problem-solving ability out on the world and solve some challenges.
Yeah. If you're a new listener, we've done a deep dive into intuition and the two styles of intuition, because there's a big difference between the styles of how someone goes about using the intuition in their personality. And the other thing I think that I want to just make this point. Remember, intuition does not equal intelligence. I think that's another thing that a lot of people make the disconnect. So a sensor who hears about somebody who's highly intuitive, maybe pattern recognizing something, might conflate the idea that intuition equals advanced intelligence, and that just couldn't be further from the truth. It just is a perceiving of the world in a different way. You're using advanced pattern recognition to understand what's going on. You're trying to see what's behind the curtain, which by definition can never be seen because it is behind the curtain, quote unquote. And so it's a perceiving process that uses advanced pattern recognition. And there's two styles of this, and you should go look up. We'll probably have in the notes below this podcast links to those podcasts. But you need to go look that up and find out some of the nuance there. It fleshes out what we're talking about. But we're not talking about intuitives are more intelligent than sensors. And I think that's where the breakdown might come, because we all want to be seen as intelligent. We all want to be intelligent. I mean, most people want to be more intelligent than they already are. That's something we all strive for, and that's not what we're talking about. We
did a podcast on Gardner's multiple intelligences, his theory of multiple intelligences, and I've noticed that one of the reasons why we have a tendency to conflate intuition with intelligence is, first, we forget that there are multiple styles of intelligence, and there are certain kinds of intelligence that trend to certain types. One of the things that I get a lot of pushback from INTJs, because I make the comment on a regular basis in podcasts and in articles that INTJs have a tendency or trend toward being the smartest person in the room, quote unquote, in the way that society has decided to think of intelligence, like analytical intelligence. And a lot of times INTJs hear me say they're the smartest person in the room, full stop. And they're not. An INTJ is not going to be the smartest person in the room. They're going to be the smartest person in the room in their very specific style of intelligence. And we just happen as society to admire that brand of intelligence. And so because society favors certain forms of intelligence over other forms, in, looking at Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, we forget that there are multiple styles of intelligence and certain types trend toward different styles. And so a sensor and the sensing types are going to trend towards specific styles of intelligence, and intuitive types are going to trend to specific styles. And societies come in and out, like the styles of intelligence they prefer is actually quite faddish. It comes in and out. In the last couple weeks, I'm going to date this podcast a little bit, but we've been watching the Olympics, which shows a brand of kinesthetic intelligence that we've all has dropped our jaws collectively as a planet, as a species. We've been celebrating the fad of kinesthetic intelligence over the last, so often. And so, or a few weeks. So we acknowledge these different styles of intelligence, but then when we think about it in terms of whether or not somebody's smarter than me, all of a sudden smart gets attached to a very specific type of intelligence, and all the other ones are just lesser forms, which is it's something that I would very much like to see come out of style. I would like that particular fad to come out of style. That said, when we conflate intuition with intelligence, we only do ourselves a disservice, regardless of whether or not we're intuitives or sensors. I think something that would actually help with this is it's a system that you came up with, Joel, after we talked about the concept of general semantics. We did a podcast on general semantics. I highly recommend listening to it. For me, learning general semantics was a complete and total game changer for me. But the theory of general semantics is that we use this, or one of the theories, is that we use the same word to mean multiple things, and it kind of messes us up. We use the same word to reference something that is a noun, the example we used in the podcast was homelessness, like a homeless person. But there are lots of different styles and reasons to be homeless. So general semantics, the principles of it, would recommend that we annotate the different styles with using different, a letter system or a number system to create distinctions around who we're actually talking about. Are we talking about homelessness 1, homelessness 2, homelessness 3? Homelessness 1 might just be somebody who's temporarily sleeping in their car. Homelessness 2 might be somebody who has no ability to take care of themselves. And so those are two different contexts. So general semantics actually works out really well in the conversation around sensing and intuition, and especially in the intuitive awakening movement, because we can apply the same annotation to all the types, indicating that everybody has a form of intuition.
So when we talk about an intuitive awakening, I think when you're introduced to the Myers-Briggs system, for example, it's a very dichotomous system. You're either introvert or extrovert. You're either intuitive or sensing. You're either thinking or feeling. You're either judging or perceiving. It's a dichotomous viewpoint. And then when you learn cognitive functions, and we've done tons of content on that, go to personhacker.com if you want to deep dive into those, you start to understand that we're actually introverted. There's parts of us that are introverted and extroverted. There's parts of us that are intuitive and sensing. There's parts of us that are thinking and feeling. There's parts of us that are judging and perceiving. And you start to get a much more fleshed out view of your personality, a much less dichotomous view. So we talk about intuitive awakening. We're actually talking about awakening intuition in the world. It just so happens that intuitives, quote unquote, the people that use this as the primary way of perceiving the world, use intuition primarily. So they are the ones that we end up targeting when we talk about awakening intuition. But we'd like to see intuition awakened on all levels in the world, by all people, because even if you are a sensor in the dichotomous view of Myers-Briggs system, you still have a cognitive function in what we call the CAR model, or your cognitive function stack technically, that is intuitive. And so one of the ways that we can get some more nuance around this is we can put an annotation, like you're talking about in general semantic terms. Are you intuitive 1, intuitive 2, intuitive 3, intuitive 4? I'm an ENFP in the Myers-Briggs system. As an example, I lead with the cognitive function technically called extroverted intuition. So I have intuition, extrovert intuition, as my primary way that I perceive the world. That's my primary way I interact with everything. So I would be considered intuitive 1. Somebody else that is an ESFP, now their primary cognitive function would be technically called extroverted sensing. They're a sensation primer. They're engaging with the world with their 5 senses and their sense of balance, touch, taste, all these things. And their intuitive process would be in the backseat of the car model, or the inferior process in the cognitive function stack. And that process would be introverted intuition, and it would be in the 4th place in their stack. So they could be classified as an intuitive 4. They still have intuition represented in their personality. It's just in a different placement. It's the last place they go almost in their personality. It's the last place they go when they're perceiving something. They usually will lead with the sensing process first.
Yeah, and then of course fill in the spaces in between. Somebody who's like an ENTJ or an INFP, their intuitive process sits in their co-pilot or auxiliary position, so they'd be intuitive 2. And then an ESFJ or an ISFP that has an intuitive process as their 10-year-old, what we call the 10-year-old, or their tertiary process, would be an intuitive 3. So you would annotate intuition with 1 through 4, depending upon how it falls in the stack. But that means that every single person is an intuitive, depending upon how you want to define that. They're either an intuitive 1, 2, 3, or 4. The same thing applies with sensing. You and I would be sensing 4, and an ISFJ or an ESTP or whatever would be a sensing 1, because their sensing process would be dominant or in the first position, and you would fill in the rest of the types as well. So we're all sensors. We're just sensing 1, 2, 3, 4. We're all intuitives. We're intuitive 1, 2, 3, 4. And of course, where your intuitive or your sensing process falls in your stack is going to very much influence how you show up to the world. It's going to very much influence your relationship with that process. It's going to influence how you, what level of comfort you have with the intuitive or the sensing process.
What you're interested in.
How much interest you have in that particular thing. How much it influences you in a conscious or unconscious way. There's a lot of different layers here. But the point is that if we're going to have a true intuitive awakening, we can't see us as intuitives and them as sensors and have yet another reason to be segregationists. This is not about segregation. It's not about creating any sort of line in the sand and saying you have to be over there and I have to be over here. It's a matter of understanding an inclusive arrangement. The point is, as you mentioned, this is for personal development, so we want everybody to get their needs met to become the best version of themselves so we can start working on world challenges, or at least that's the perspective we come from. So when we have this intuitive awakening movement, I guess it's more like a request for the audience, a request for anybody who might be listening to this particular podcast. The request is that if you have any sort of antagonistic feelings or any sort of superiority or inferiority around your type. Now, we're going to have to what, Isabel called, Isabel Briggs or Myers-Briggs called type patriotism. And type patriotism is when you like being your type. Like, I mean, I got to admit, I love being an ENTP. It's fun as, it's fun as balls. So I'm digging being an ENTP. But do I think that ENTPs are the superior race? Every ENTP just went, yes. No, we're not. But the question is, do I think that being an ENTP automatically makes me better than other people? And if I do, then that means I've got some stuff. I've got some problems that have nothing to do with being an ENTP, right? I've got some insecurities that are manifesting as superiority, and I should probably get some of that handled. But if you are feeling like being an intuitive makes you superior, then recognize that you've got some stuff going on inside of you that has nothing to do with being an intuitive. You have some insecurities, some marginalization. You've got some stuff going on with you, and you're just using being an intuitive as a way to, sort of brush that over. You're using it as a way to not have to look at that part of who you are, the part that feels marginalized or insecure, and actually doing something about that. And the same thing applies with being a sensor. If you feel you're superior or inferior because you're a sensor, because of how maybe information or content has been presented to you, recognize that that's not reality either. Like you're not inferior or superior to being a sensor, just like we're not inferior or superior being intuitive. And the less segregationist we get around this, the more inclusive we get, the more we recognize that we're all intuitives and all sensors, depending upon the general semantic annotation, the faster we're going to get to that place where we can get some of this content out into the collective unconscious and maybe do something about it. Maybe get it implemented as a concept in our schools and start teaching children based on their learning styles, based on this information. We can get it it's been in the business realm for some extent, but maybe we could get it in the business realm in a way that's not as toxic as it currently is, where people are hiring and firing based on it. Maybe we can get it more like making sure people are getting their needs met in a business context, making sure that they're in their flow state in when they're working. Maybe get it in like the most healthy way possible, implemented in business, and not the way that's kind of been implemented for the last 40 years. But regardless of all of that, this is a request to the audience to do everything we can to make sure that we're operating at a high vibration here. This is not a low vibration place. This is not a place to deal with wounding. This is a place to raise all the ships, to be better versions of ourselves. And if you see any of this behavior happening, please feel free to call it out. Please feel free to make sure that people understand that there shouldn't be a place for that kind of thinking in the Myers-Briggs realm or in the typology realm. That's not really its original purpose, and it's a bastardization of why typology was invented, and it's really not serving anybody, including yourself.
So what do you think? I want to hear from you. You're the third person in this conversation, and your voice matters. Come over to personalityhacker.com, leave a comment or ask a question directly below this podcast. We want to know what your experience has been. Tell us your story. Maybe you've had a mindset shift on this. Maybe you have found yourself bullying people online, quote unquote, or so to speak, and having some superiority around being an intuitive or being a sensor, or maybe inferiority around one of these. We want to know what's happening for you on that front. And again, personalityhacker.com is where you can come over and leave a comment, ask a question. And I would also recommend, if this is your first time hearing our podcast, we have a ton of recordings, a ton of articles, and a ton of resources, all for free on the website, that you can do some deep dives into your own personality type, and also some of these ideas we've been talking around, like cognitive functions and intuition and sensation. We've detailed out a lot of this on the website. So personalityhacker.com, again, is the best place to go find all of that stuff.
If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you are feeling particularly generous, you could leave us a rating and review on iTunes, which helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
Thanks for being with us this week on Personality Hacker. We can't wait to talk with you on the next episode.